This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. So I was scrolling on the internet as one does, and I saw that Rashad Higgins and Christian Kirksey had retired from the NFL and wanted to make sure that they retired as members of the Cleveland Browns. They signed a one-day contract, kind of did the whole ceremonial thing. And it made me think about when Joe Hayden did something very similar. And to me, as a Browns fan, stuff like that puts things into perspective of where this team is versus where this team was, especially like before 2018. And it kind of illustrates how much of a better place they are at. Because for my entire childhood to adulthood, right, basically up until, even post-grad, right? So like from when I was born to when I went to high school and graduated high school and went through college, and even couple of years after college, basically until the point of my life where I started this YouTube channel, there were not many Browns players that were proud of playing for the Cleveland Browns. Usually you would hear these guys talk about it as something they would like to forget. A blemish on their resume, right? Like, it's not something that they're proud of. It's not something that they come back to. It's not something that they take pride in, of being a Cleveland Brown or having played for the Cleveland Browns, or just think back about their time playing for the Browns fondly. And seeing Christian Kirksey retire Brown, seeing Rashad Higgins retire Brown, seeing Joe Hayden, it reminds me that we're crossing into this new era, hopefully, as Cleveland Browns fans, where that stuff's going to be normal. Like, this is not going to be something that we think about that much. But for those Browns fans who are my age and older, we have seen that 20-year drought of people really saying anything positive about their experiences in Cleveland. And it made me wonder, what players on the Browns' current roster will likely retire a Cleveland Brown based on the work that they've done on the field? Because that's the next step, right? Rashad Higgins, he was loved in Cleveland, mainly because he stepped up in a very dark time for the team. He was on the team when they were winless. Same thing with Christian Kirksey. Rashad did have a couple of good moments in that 2020 season. So, the fan base fell in love with him, but it was more or less during that era where the Browns weren't that good. So our bar for what made the fan base fall in love with you was very low at the time. Now we're moving into an era where these players have to put in legitimate bodies of work in order to get that love, to get that recognition, and to get to retire as Cleveland Browns. So that's why I want to look at guys who have put in that body of work in that Cleveland Browns uniform that I could see easily retiring as a Cleveland Brown. I think there's some interesting conversations to be had in this video. So Nick Chubb is one that's not going to surprise anybody, right? Nick Chubb, Myles Garrett. These guys, the second they retire, whether they played for the Cleveland Browns at the end of their career or not, will be Cleveland Browns forever. We will remember Nick Chubb for what he does for the Cleveland Browns. If he ever wears another uniform, it will never feel right. And he's just a forever Brown, right? Like, he's played here long enough. He has had impact here long enough that is set in stone for Nick Chubb. Like, no matter what happens for the rest of his career, he is a Browns legend. That's written. Like, he don't got to get another rushing yard, and that's the case for Nick Chubb. The same thing with Myles Garrett. Myles Garrett can never get another sack in the Cleveland Browns uniform again. He is a Browns legend. He holds 3 of the 4 best sack seasons in Cleveland Browns history. He's one of 1 guys to get a Defensive Player of the Year award for the Cleveland Browns since coming back from reactivation. And I'm pretty sure in franchise history, but the Browns' history is so deep that you don't want to just say stuff like that if you're not 100% sure. But I'm for sure he's the only guy to win Defensive Player of the Year since they came back since 99. Yeah, Myles Garrett, again, same thing as Nick Chubb. If you ever see Myles Garrett in another jersey, it will feel wrong. And it won't just feel wrong for those two players to wear a different jersey. To us, it will feel wrong to football fans to see Nick Chubb in a different jersey, to see Myles Garrett in a different jersey. Think about the uncomfortable feeling you had when you saw like Aaron Rodgers run out there wearing number 8 for the Jets. It didn't feel right. Or like when you go back and look at them Brett Favre highlights where he's like rocking a Jets jersey or rocking a Minnesota Vikings jersey, and just don't feel. Or when you see AP at the end of his career and he's wearing all kind of different jerseys and jersey numbers, it never felt right for us, even as football fans, to see that guy outside of his legacy franchise. I think those two have put together such a strong body of work that they're above everybody else. They are Browns legends already. And the second they retire, they will always be associated with the Cleveland Browns, whether they play here for the rest of their career, which I hope is the case, right? These are the type of players you want to never wear another uniform. These are the type of players you want to forever and only be associated with your franchise. These are the type of players that you build plaques of, right? And you put examples of, and you let people know when they come in to the Cleveland Browns organization, this is where the bar is, right? Nick Chubb's face goes there with Otto Graham. It goes there with Jim Brown. It goes there with Paul Brown. It goes there with Paul Warfield. It goes there with Ozzie Newsome. You name a Browns legend, Bernie Kosar. Like, Myles Garrett's face makes sense there. In my opinion, Nick Chubb is a Hall of Famer. In my opinion, I think Myles Garrett is a no doubt first ballot Hall of Famer no matter what happens for the rest of his career. So those two are in a class above their own. We haven't had guys like that since coming back from reactivation, and that's what those two are. Joe Bitonio is another one who, he's a legend here. Not somebody who I think is going to have an easy time making the Hall of Fame, just because the sports writers who vote on the Hall of Fame don't value certain offensive line positions because they view offensive line as a hierarchy, right? I talked about this when Vach was on here, but sometimes people fall into this trap of thinking, okay, well, if you are really good at offensive line, you would play tackle, right? And if you're a guard, you're just a bad tackle. Or if you're a center, you're just a bad guard. But that's not how it works. These positions are independent of each other. Somebody can be a great guard and maybe they wouldn't have been a great tackle, but it's not really relevant. It's a different skill set at those different offensive line positions, and they're not as interchangeable as some people want to make them look. And the only reason people feel like they're interchangeable is because we have some of the greatest athletes in the world playing in the offensive line that have made people believe things that just aren't true, right? But Joe, because of that bias that the sports writers who vote on this award will have a hard time making the Hall of Fame. I would argue that Joe is one of the best guards of his era. He's always been in that conversation for the best guards of his era. I think if you have been in the conversation your entire career of top 5 in your position, you should be a Hall of Famer. Right. I think that's the criteria for me, right? If you are in that top 5 conversation, you are in a Hall of Famer at your position, right? If you are a top 5 tight end your entire career, you should be in that Hall of Fame conversation. If you were a top 5 quarterback your entire career, you should be in that Hall of Fame conversation. If you were top 5 left guard, or just in general guards in football, right? If you don't want to just switch them up by position, if you were a top 5 guard in football, which Joe Bitonio was always in that conversation, always there at 3, 2, sometimes 1, you should probably be a Hall of Famer. And the same goes for kickers and punters, right? Like, because why not? They've been playing the game long enough. They should probably be able to get in the Hall of Fame. I get that you want to flood the Hall of Fame with a bunch of special teams guys, but I do think that we are smart enough to make the distinction of somebody who makes the Hall of Fame because they're special teamers. The same way we make the distinction from somebody who's all NFL or all pro or Pro Bowl because of because of special teams. So I think that should also be included. But my thoughts on the Hall of Fame and how people vote for it aside, Joe Bitonio, Browns legend. I mean, he's been here since 2014. He's likely going to retire a Cleveland Brown. And the second he retires, he will always be associated with the city of Cleveland, Cleveland Browns, similar to how Joe Thomas did, and really did carry that torch for Joe Thomas into this next generation. And hopefully, the Browns get somebody like a DeJuan Jones who can continue to carry that torch for the legacy of Joe Thomas, the legacy of Joe Bitonio into this next generation for the Cleveland Browns. I got a couple of guys here that I'm not sure about, because they weren't drafted here, right? Nick Chubb drafted here. Myles Garrett drafted here. Joe Bitonio drafted here. These two guys played for different teams, but there's an argument to be made that both of these guys have had notable careers and were most notable when they were Cleveland Browns. The first guy is Wyatt Teller, originally played for the Buffalo Bills, didn't really get that much playing time, got traded to the Browns, still didn't get that much playing time in 2019. 2020, his whole career changes. The Browns put him in position to be successful. He becomes one of the best guards in football. He's not somebody who's going to be a Hall of Fame player because he just hasn't have the longevity that a Joe Bitonio has. But I do think there's a potential for him to always be kind of a Browns legend, somebody who retires as a Cleveland Brown, somebody who's most fondly remembered for their time in the brown and orange. The other guy on this list is a much more interesting conversation to have because you have to really look at the numbers. You have to look at the time this player spent in specific places, and it's not somebody you would think of because he was so well known before coming to the Cleveland Browns, and that guy is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper is one of the most interesting cases in this conversation because he is known most for being a Cowboy, right? Or a Raider. I would argue most people remember Amari Cooper being a Cowboy. He played at Oakland the longest, but his best football by far has been played as a Cleveland Brown. And if he gets an extension this offseason, which puts him in Cleveland for 2 more years, which means that he would have played 4 seasons as a Cleveland Browns, which means that unless he returns to Oakland or returns to the Raiders or returns to the Dallas Cowboys, he will have played for Cleveland longer than any other team. And the argument is, if he played for the Browns the longest, if he played and got the most production with the Cleveland Browns, how is he not going to be associated with the Cleveland Browns forever? Now, again, Amari Cooper's a tough case because he's been traded around so much that he doesn't really have a team. And he's somebody who can kind of pick and choose which team he decides to call home. Some people are always going to remember Amari Cooper as a Dallas Cowboy. Some people are going to always think of Amari Cooper as an Oakland Raider. But the conversation does need to be had that he might be a Cleveland Brown, like career-wise, when it's all said and done. And I think that's one to watch because the body of work is undeniable. And how weird would that be for us Browns fans who grew up through the dark ages to see somebody get traded to Cleveland and then be fondly remembered for the time that they spent in Cleveland? We used to get into Jamie Collins' situation where Jamie Collins comes to Cleveland, hates it, tries to forget it, goes to New England, act like he ain't never played here, right? Like that's usually what we're used to getting, the kind of treatment, but that might be the opposite of what we're getting from Amari Cooper. I got 2 more guys on the list that I think they have done enough in their body of work as Cleveland Browns to retire as Cleveland Browns when it's all said and done. Denzel Ward. I know some people still debate whether he's given us enough, but the fact is that you don't ever think about Denzel Ward being the 4th overall pick and think that the Browns missed that. And that tells me everything I need to know about the body of work that Denzel Ward has put together. And when he's healthy, he's the best corner in football. He stayed healthy more and more the last few years. He's been instrumental to the Browns' success the last couple of years. He's from Cleveland. He's a Brown, right? He will forever be associated and remembered for the body of work he put together as a Cleveland Brown. The same thing is true for David Njoku. You don't think about this. David been here like 8 years. And he might go somewhere else at the end of this contract. He might stay with the Cleveland Browns, but his body of work in Cleveland, especially if he puts together another season like he did last year, it's pretty much cemented that he will be remembered for what he did as a Cleveland Brown. Let's go to guys that, for reasons I don't think are going to be related to their level of play, they're not going to retire as Browns. First guy on the list, and you might argue level of play will be a factor. I think that there's still time for this argument to be had. Deshaun Watson. I don't think no matter anything that Deshaun Watson does in a Cleveland Brown uniform, Deshaun Watson can win a Super Bowl. Deshaun Watson can win 2 Super Bowls. He will be beloved in Cleveland, but he will never truly feel like a Brown to a lot of people not because he of anything that people feel about him on the field or even off the field. I think this has to do with the fact that he was just so famous as a Houston Texan. Like, he was so famous for playing for the Texans that him playing for the Browns feels like a definitive second. Like, I think a great example of this is LeBron James in LA. There are some people who will remember Miami Bron. We know that at the end of the day, LeBron James is always going to feel like a Cavalier. And then there's those Laker years where he did a lot of important stuff, right? He broke the scoring record. He won a championship. He played the best basketball anybody's ever seen out of somebody 38 plus. He did a lot of great things in LA, but he was so famous as a Cavalier. He was so famous as a Miami Heat that his body of work, like, he just don't feel like a Laker. Right? Like, when you talk about great Lakers, you're never going to talk about LeBron James the same way you talk about Shaquille O'Neal, Jerry West, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant. It's just not like that with LeBron in LA because he was so beloved and so well known on a different team. The same is true for Deshaun Watson. He will always kind of feel like a Houston Texan because he was very, very famous as a Houston Texan. Now, he's probably never going to be that famous again, right? More infamous than famous. Even if the body of work is there, even if the play is there, he throws for 4,000 yards, 5,000 yards. There will be people who think of him fondly in Cleveland whenever it comes to his on-field career. That's definitely a possibility. But as far as him feeling like a Brown in the same way that Nick Chubb, Myles Garrett, Joe Bitonio, Denzel Ward, and David Njoku feel like Browns, I don't think that's ever going to be the case. And I think that's fine, right? I think that sometimes that happens with players. I think Odell Beckham is another example of it, where Jarvis Landry wasn't as famous for playing for the Miami Dolphins. So when he came to Cleveland, he felt like a Brown after a couple of years, where Odell Beckham was super famous for playing with the New York Giants, that he never really felt like a Brown because it never felt right, him wearing a different jersey than the New York Giants jersey, if you understand what I'm saying. But I think that does have a factor in these conversations, or at least if Deshaun Watson did retire as a Cleveland Brown, it would feel weird to most people. I think people would understand it, but it would feel weird to most people, especially outside the Cleveland Browns fan base. Another guy like that is Zadarius Smith. Zadarius Smith is kind of a mercenary. He's jumped around with so many different teams that I don't think he's going to forever really be associated with anybody but the team that drafted him, the Baltimore Ravens. I think he always kind of feels like a Raven. His best body of work is not even with Baltimore, but when you jump around teams like that, you're always going to feel like the team that drafted you. And I think it's too late for Zadarius to really feel like anybody else, to really feel like anybody else's player. He's always going to kind of, like, Baltimore's always going to feel like home to Za'Darius. I think that's just the truth of it, even though he's going to put together some great bodies of works in Minnesota, in Green Bay, and in Cleveland. The next guy is Jack Conklin. Similar thing. He wasn't super famous for playing with the Titans, but I think his best body of work and his most consistent body of work was with the Titans. He put together a solid body of work in Cleveland, made an all-pro team, but he's going to feel like a Titan, right? Like he's always going to feel like a Titan. Two guys I think that I didn't include in that conversation, I think had the potential to build that body of work, but, you know, a little bit young. Martin Emerson, Grant Delpit, JOK, actually 3 people. I lied. I think those 3 have the potential to put together the body of work that could make them guys who you can obviously see as retiring as Cleveland Browns. And I will add a non-Browns player that some of y'all think I'm a hater of, but I do think deserves a spot in the conversation when it comes to guys who could potentially retire is Cleveland Browns. And it's more about where this player played and the time that player played and what changed when that player played more than it is about the numbers that player put up. Kind of similar to how we feel about Rashad Higgins, and that's Baker Mayfield. Right now, the conversation around him is too toxic and polarizing because people are still trying to prove points about the Deshaun Watson trade and was that the right move or not. But once we get past trying to prove a point about whether you like that trade or not, and we just kind of talk about the history of the team, the history of the Cleveland Browns and the ball that was played in that period and what happened to get to where we are, I think we're going to land at a place that's a little bit more respectful of where Baker Mayfield sits in it. I don't know if he would retire as a Cleveland Brown given how everything ended with him, but maybe he'll let that go. Maybe the Browns will let it go, and you know, cooler heads will prevail. But I do think that at some point it does make sense for the Browns to kind of come to peace with Baker Mayfield, because whether people like it or not, and I think the reason it's so polarizing has more to do with the points that people are trying to make than Baker Mayfield itself. Because, you know, people are hell-bent on trying to prove that Baker Mayfield was the greatest mistake that the Browns ever made for trading him. And there's people hell-bent on proving that he is one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL. Like, it's just too toxic right now. But once that wipes away, there is a conversation to be had because he was the quarterback of the team when things really started to change and spurred some of that early momentum to get the Browns where they are. Now, is he as responsible for everything as people try to make it out to be? I have heavy disagreements about that. But the truth is that he did play good enough at quarterback for the Browns to not be looked at as a objectively awful team. They were looked at as a team that could be good. They traded for Odell Beckham. That brought in a lot of excitement, probably brought in a lot of fans. Didn't have the success with Odell Beckham that we all wanted, but did have success in 2020 and had one of the better seasons the Cleveland Browns have had, if not the best season the Cleveland Browns have had since coming back in 99. And he was the quarterback of that team, and he did play well during that season. Obviously, 2021 didn't play that well. Is what it is. But the same way we don't remember how much Tim Couch sucked at the end, the same way we don't remember how much Kelly Holcomb sucked at the end, the same way we don't remember how much Derek Anderson sucked at the end, is the same way we're not going to really care about how much Baker Mayfield sucked at the end the further away we get from it. And I think that he does have a place in the conversation of people who are important to where the Browns are, what they try to build. And I think they'll recognize that at some point. But I hope y'all appreciated this video. This is more of a video about where the history is going with the Cleveland Browns. And I think it is a fascinating conversation to have. I hope you guys enjoy it, but y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.